Pine Creek, Alabama, baked under a relentless summer sun. The small town's main street was quiet, almost lazy, except for the faint hum of the interstate feeding into it. Officer Vance Harlan sat in his patrol car, sweat glistening on his brow, sipping lukewarm sweet tea. At 45, his frame had grown heavy with years of inertia, yet he carried himself with an inflated sense of authority. 2 decades on the force had taught him how to wield fear, and he did so with the precision of a man convinced the town belonged to him. Vance had a favorite spot, a gravel turnout behind a massive billboard for Langston's personal injury law. From there, he could monitor traffic and, more importantly, decide who was worthy of his attention. That day, a sleek black Range Rover appeared, glinting in the sun, moving precisely at the speed limit. That alone sent his instincts on alert. Who drove the speed limit unless hiding something? He lurched onto the asphalt, gravel crunching beneath his tires. Lights flicked on, no siren, just the silent assertion of authority. The SUV slowed, signaling politely, pulling to the shoulder near the old Baptist church. Vance approached, hand resting on his Glock, a smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. In his mind, the driver and passenger were just another couple to intimidate, to exert dominance over, to make small-town law enforcement feel momentarily heroic. The passenger window slid down, revealing a composed woman, sharp features, hair tightly secured. She met his gaze without fear. Vance's irritation spiked. She sounded educated, competent, a tone he didn't appreciate. "License and registration," he barked. The woman's calm counter, the driver's composed stance, sparked an unfamiliar tightening in Vance's chest. He escalated, demanding they step out. Hands on the hood, knees apart, Vance's pat-downs were invasive, calculated to provoke. Every action reinforced his self-image as the enforcer, the hammer. He felt a hard lump in the driver's back pocket, a wallet. He snatched it, tossing it on the hood without inspection. The woman, Nia, warned him. He ignored her, pressing forward, spinning her, asserting control. The SUV yielded nothing to his assumptions. Then came the discovery. A Sig Sauer P-32 pulled from beneath the driver's seat. Vance's heart raced. "Gun," he shouted, weapon raised, but the man before him, Kendrick, didn't flinch. Calm, authoritative, he corrected Vance. The firearm was legal. Confusion, fear, and a primal rush of authority collided in Vance's mind. Backup arrived, 2 local officers, eager but naive. In the back of his mind, Vance felt invincible, unaware that every move was being observed by seasoned federal operatives. The handcuffs clicked on Kendrick and Nia, who remained composed. Vance picked up the wallets, expecting counterfeit deception, only to be met with gold badges. Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent, Senior Prosecutor. Reality crashed over him like the heat of the Alabama sun had never done. Every assumption, every prejudice, every moment of bullying was a mistake of monumental scale. Inside the station, tension built as Vance tried to assert control, but the truth of their identities shifted the power balance instantly. The small-town cop, accustomed to fear and respect, was suddenly the subject of scrutiny. Federal authority moved in with precision. The small police department rendered secondary. Every attempt at control was stripped away, leaving only exposure, embarrassment, and the onset of career-ending consequences. Vance Harlan sat, frozen, as the story of his life, his reputation, his choices, his prejudices unfolded in front of him. Humidity, heat, and hubris had guided him to this point. Outside Pine Creek continued, unaware of the reckoning arriving within its precinct. And within the quiet moments before federal action, Vance's ego faced a reckoning it had never anticipated. The simple truth that no badge could shield ignorance or prejudice from the law. The sun pressed down on Pine Creek, the asphalt radiating heat, a physical reminder of the tension still lingering from the roadside encounter. Vance Harlan sat in his patrol car, hands shaking slightly as he replayed the events in his mind. The Range Rover, the gun, the badges, all of it was more than he could comprehend. He tried to convince himself it was a fluke, that the federal agents had simply allowed him to think he was in control. But the truth was undeniable. He had misjudged everything. Inside the station, Kendrick and Nia were seated calmly, their composure unshaken. Kendrick's deep voice carried authority as he began outlining the investigation, that had brought them through Pine Creek. Vance had unknowingly interrupted a federal operation tracking a network of corruption and kickbacks that implicated local law enforcement and the town's most prominent figures. Every word they spoke felt like a punch, exposing years of Harlan's unchecked behavior and complicity. The room was a microcosm of American law and order, tensions coiled like springs. Bryce Caldwell and Officer Reed, junior officers, stood awkwardly, caught between loyalty to a senior officer and the overwhelming presence of federal authority. Their eyes darted to Vance, who attempted to salvage dignity through aggression, but the situation was beyond control. Vance's mind raced through every possible legal argument, every excuse. His ego, built over decades, began to crumble. The dashcam footage, once his shield, now documented his errors in vivid clarity. Each slur, each unlawful command, each threat was recorded, immortalized in high-definition evidence that would follow him for the rest of his life. As Kendrick described the investigation, Vance realized the enormity of the consequences. This wasn't a simple traffic stop gone wrong. This was the unraveling of a system he had helped perpetuate, a system where fear and bias had been currency. Every pullover, every questionable arrest, every bribe accepted, these were pieces of a larger puzzle now coming into focus, and Vance was a central figure, exposed and vulnerable. Outside the station, Pine Creek remained oblivious, the ordinary rhythms of small-town life continuing. Inside, the federal agents moved with meticulous precision, securing the scene, ensuring no further harm could come to them or the suspects. Vance tried to assert dominance, issuing orders, but each command was met with silence or polite defiance. The hierarchy he had depended upon no longer existed. Nia took meticulous notes, documenting every transgression, every abuse of power. Her actions were methodical, professional, and unyielding. Vance watched her, feeling the weight of his miscalculations. Every gesture, every word he had used to intimidate now worked against him. He could see the unfolding legal consequences in her steady eyes and the quiet efficiency of Kendrick's demeanor. As the first wave of federal intervention concluded, Vance was left isolated, a man whose authority had evaporated under the scrutiny of higher powers. The officers who once deferred to him now viewed him with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Vance Harlan, once the unchallenged enforcer of Pine Creek, faced the reality that his actions had set into motion a chain reaction that would dismantle the local power structure. And amidst it all, Kendrick and Nia prepared for the next steps, already coordinating with their team to address the corruption in the town. The storm had arrived, and Vance was caught in its center, powerless, as federal law moved inexorably toward justice. For the first time in decades, he felt the full weight of accountability bearing down on him, the realization settling in that this was only the beginning of his reckoning. The back of the cruiser felt tighter than usual as Vance Harlan sat between Kendrick and Nia, cuffed and uncomfortably aware of every inch of the confined space. He had spent years exerting control over his environment, but now he was subject to someone else's authority, forced to witness the consequences of his hubris firsthand. Kendrick remained calm, a pillar of measured restraint, while Nia's sharp eyes missed nothing, noting behaviors and statements that would later have legal ramifications. The drive to the Pine Creek Police Department seemed to stretch endlessly, every mile a reminder of Vance's miscalculations. Bryce Caldwell, young and inexperienced, kept glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, unsure how to reconcile loyalty to his department with the reality before him. Each officer in the car became acutely aware that this was no ordinary stop. This was the collision of small-town policing with federal oversight, a reckoning that would shake the foundations of their careers. At the station, Vance attempted to control the narrative, describing the supposed criminal behavior, the illegal firearm, and the imagined threats. But as Kendrick and Nia's credentials were revealed, the power dynamic shifted completely. Vance's voice faltered, his carefully constructed authority crumbling under the weight of undeniable federal identification. The air seemed to thicken with tension, the once familiar station now a theater of exposure, each officer a witness to the unraveling of Vance's career. Chief Warren Hayes arrived, a relic of a bygone era, pragmatic yet overwhelmed by the unfolding events. He attempted to mediate, but the truth was stark and unyielding. Vance had misjudged the situation in every possible way. The badges, the calm demeanor, the professionalism of Kendrick and Nia all exposed Vance's prejudices and his history of overreach. The room was silent, save for the quiet scratching of Nia's pen as she documented every infraction, every threat, every abuse of power. Federal tactical teams began to arrive outside, their presence a silent but powerful confirmation that the situation had escalated beyond local jurisdiction. Vance's attempts to assert control were rendered impotent by the authority and precision of the agents moving to secure the scene. The tension inside the station was palpable. Officers froze, unsure how to act, as the reality of federal oversight became concrete and unavoidable. Kendrick and Nia moved with a calm efficiency, securing their own safety while preparing to dismantle the web of corruption that had allowed Vance's abuses to persist. Vance sat, sweating, isolated and powerless, the culmination of decades of unchecked behavior manifesting in the form of accountability. The dashcam footage, once a potential shield, now served as damning evidence of his misjudgments and unlawful actions. Outside, Pine Creek went about its day, oblivious to the storm descending upon its institutions. Inside, Vance faced the consequences of a lifetime of assumptions, biases, and abuses of authority. The federal agents, methodical and precise, began their work, and Vance realized for the first time that his perception of control had been an illusion. The system he had manipulated for years was now operating independently of him, and there was no place for him in it. As the tactical operations continued, Vance's mind raced through every decision, every stop, every act of intimidation he had ever carried out. The full scope of the implications settled in: arrests, indictments, lawsuits, and the dismantling of the local power structures. Vance Harlan, once the undisputed enforcer of Pine Creek, found himself at the mercy of a legal system that operated on principles far larger than the small-town authority he had long commanded. The moment marked the beginning of his comprehensive reckoning. The Sallyport doors clanged shut behind them, sealing Vance Harlan in a place where his authority meant nothing. He tried to assert control, barking orders, but every word echoed off the concrete walls and fell flat. Bryce Caldwell and Officer Reed stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief, unsure whether to support Vance or obey the unmistakable presence of federal authority. Kendrick, Whittaker, and Nia remained composed, the calm center of a storm Vance had created. Kendrick's voice was low, measured, as he calmly outlined the violations and systemic corruption that had persisted in Pine Creek. Each sentence, precise and deliberate, was a hammer against the walls of Vance's ego, dismantling decades of inflated self-importance in real time. Vance could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The illegal threats, the racially biased targeting, the abusive pat-downs, all crystallized as undeniable evidence. He glanced at the dashcam feed, expecting defense or manipulation, but instead found a record of his misdeeds, capturing the exact tone, expressions, and words that would haunt him in the coming proceedings. The officers in the room, once deferential to his authority, now regarded him with unease, some with fear, others with quiet disapproval. Vance Harlan, the hammer, the self-appointed arbiter of Pine Creek, was exposed, powerless, and alone. The tension was punctuated by the low hum of air conditioning, the soft scratch of Nia's pen, and the distant sound of federal tactical vehicles arriving outside. Chief Warren Hayes entered, attempting to assert control over the crumbling scene, but even his presence was insufficient to restore order. The badges in Kendrick and Nia's possession served as a visual and symbolic reminder that federal oversight superseded local authority. Vance's every instinct to dominate, intimidate, and control was systematically stripped away, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. The realization of the consequences settled heavily on Vance. His misjudgments had led to the capture of high-ranking federal officials, a violation that transcended local politics and small-town justice. He sat back, sweat running down his face, as Kendrick outlined the scope of the investigation, linking Vance's daily abuses to a network of corruption extending to the town's courthouse, mayor's office, and other influential figures. As federal agents moved with precision, documenting and securing evidence, Vance's attempts at resistance became futile posturing. The small-town authority he had relied upon for years was powerless against the machinery of law and justice, operating with efficiency far beyond his comprehension. Vance's mind churned through every decision, every biased judgment, every abuse of power. The reality was unavoidable. His actions had triggered an unstoppable force of accountability. The federal presence was meticulous, methodical, and thorough, leaving no room for the kind of improvisation and control Vance had wielded for decades. As the operations inside and outside the station continued, Vance began to comprehend the depth of his isolation. The entire local law enforcement network he had dominated, manipulated, and feared was being examined, scrutinized, and dismantled. Every past action, every assumption, every act of intimidation now exposed him to consequences he had never imagined, marking the beginning of a permanent reversal of fortune. Vance Harlan sat rigidly in the corner of the booking room, the weight of realization pressing down like a leaden blanket. He had always imagined himself as untouchable in Pine Creek, a king in a small kingdom, but now the federal agents had stripped that illusion away. Each officer present, from Bryce to Reed to Sergeant Ridley, had shifted subtly to the far side of the room, distancing themselves from the epicenter of chaos that Vance embodied. Nia Whittaker scribbled rapidly in her notebook, documenting each illegal command, each abusive gesture, each threat of a strip search. Her pen scratched methodically, the sound unnervingly calm amid the tension. Vance, whose authority once went unquestioned, realized with growing horror that this record would become the keystone of his downfall. Kendrick's gaze was calm, measured, and unflinching. The man's composure was a stark contrast to Vance's unraveling state, and it reminded him just how little control he truly had. Outside, the rumble of federal vehicles approached, a distant herald of the intervention about to unfold. Vance's bravado, once a shield, now felt like a mockery of his own impotence. The tactical team arrived, their movements precise, systematic, and overwhelming in their authority. They bypassed local officers, making a beeline for Kendrick and Nia, ensuring the suspects were protected and the scene secured. Vance's attempts to assert command were ignored, rendering him irrelevant in the theater of law enforcement far larger than Pine Creek. Assistant Director Margaret Hale entered, sharp and imposing, cutting through the chaos with a single authoritative presence. Her words, direct and uncompromising, relieved Chief Hayes of command, signaling the transition of the precinct to a federal crime scene. The enormity of Vance's misjudgments became undeniable. The network of corruption, the collusion, the unchecked abuses, everything he had perpetuated was about to be exposed on a scale he had never anticipated. Vance, cuffed and powerless, watched as the local and federal powers intersected. Every decision he had made, every prejudiced judgment, every act of intimidation was now under scrutiny. The dashboard camera, once his tool for control, now immortalized his misdeeds in high definition. The room's silence was punctuated by the low hum of electronics and the steady movements of agents executing their plan. Bryce and Reed, junior officers caught in the tide of federal authority, observed in shock. Loyalty to Vance had collided with the reality of undeniable federal oversight. Their eyes, wide and uncertain, reflected the gravity of the situation. They were witnesses to the dismantling of a small-town power structure, their perceptions of authority forever altered. Vance's mind raced, recalling every encounter, every traffic stop, every abuse of authority. The weight of accountability, previously abstract, now manifested with brutal clarity. Pine Creek's small-town law, his once unquestioned dominion, had collided with the immovable force of federal justice, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless. As the tactical team secured the room and Kendrick and Nia prepared for the next steps, Vance realized fully that the consequences of his life's choices were unavoidable. The web of corruption he had sustained, the prejudices he had acted upon, and the power he had wielded recklessly were all set to be dismantled, leaving him to face the full measure of accountability and the total collapse of his career and reputation. The humid air of Pine Creek clung to every surface as Vance Harlan was escorted to the back of a federal SUV. The realization of his situation weighed heavier than the cuffs on his wrists. His once formidable authority evaporated, replaced by fear and uncertainty. The media cameras outside captured his every move, a visual record of his downfall, magnifying every misstep he had made over decades. Inside the station, Kendrick and Nia moved with purpose, coordinating with federal agents to secure the evidence and protect the integrity of the investigation. Each movement was deliberate, precise, and executed with the confidence of professionals who had faced danger and maintained composure. Vance, in contrast, was a study in tension, his body rigid, every muscle anticipating a threat that now existed only in his imagination. Chief Hayes watched, helpless, as federal authority overtook his precinct. His attempts to maintain control were symbolic at best. The badges in Kendrick and Nia's hands rendered local jurisdiction secondary. Vance could feel the magnitude of his mistakes, the ripple effects of years spent abusing power for personal gain. Every memory, every incident where he had exerted dominance, now became part of the narrative against him. Outside, the town remained unaware of the unraveling, the daily rhythms continuing with oblivious serenity. Inside, the station was a hive of coordinated federal activity. Evidence was documented, computers seized, and local officers given clear instructions to comply. Vance's attempts to interject or manipulate were met with polite but firm disinterest. His influence, once absolute, had been nullified. Vance's mind raced as he recalled every decision, every abuse of his badge, and every assumption made about those he policed. The dashcam footage that had once been his potential safeguard now served as undeniable evidence of misconduct. The weight of accountability pressed on him, unrelenting and absolute. The tactical team, methodical and efficient, ensured Kendrick and Nia's safety while simultaneously securing the station. Every action reinforced the inevitability of justice. The precision of law enforcement operating beyond the small-town dynamics Vance had exploited. Vance's own officers, once deferential, now watched in silent apprehension, the illusion of loyalty replaced by fear and uncertainty. As Kendrick and Nia prepared for the next phase of the operation, targeting systemic corruption beyond the immediate incident, Vance sat shackled and isolated, a man stripped of influence and forced to confront the consequences of his prejudices, abuses, and blind adherence to power. The process was unyielding, meticulous, and absolute, leaving no room for evasion or manipulation. The reality of federal oversight settled in. Pine Creek's small-town power structure, built on fear, prejudice, and manipulation, was being dismantled piece by piece. Vance's arrogance, hubris, and misjudgments had set into motion a cascade of accountability that would reshape the landscape of local law enforcement and expose the systemic failings that had allowed his behavior to persist unchecked for decades. Vance Harlan's world shrank further as he was processed into the federal detention system. Gone was the small-town dominance, replaced by the sterile, suffocating reality of confinement. The intake process was dehumanizing, stripped, inspected, and assigned a uniform that smelled of industrial detergent and old sweat. Each procedure was a reminder that his badge no longer afforded protection. The other inmates regarded him with instant recognition, a former officer, famous now for all the wrong reasons. The concrete walls of his new cell were cold, impersonal, and unyielding. Vance's cellmate, a massive man with Aryan Brotherhood tattoos, sized him up with a mix of curiosity and contempt. The man's presence was a stark contrast to the fearful compliance Vance had cultivated on the streets of Pine Creek. Here, he was the outsider, the prey, and every instinct that had served him in law enforcement was useless. Vance's attempts to negotiate protection or leverage were met with harsh truths. The other inmates, streetwise and hardened, knew the value of information and the cost of misplaced loyalty. Civil asset forfeiture had stripped him of his possessions, wealth, and security. He was exposed, powerless, and acutely aware of the precariousness of his position in a world that had no tolerance for his past authority. The echoes of Pine Creek's streets, the encounters, the bias, the intimidation, all played relentlessly in his mind. Every act of overreach had been recorded, documented, and now formed the narrative of his downfall. Vance realized that his long-standing belief in the invincibility of his badge was a dangerous delusion, one that had led directly to this moment of vulnerability. In the sterile confines of federal custody, the media attention amplified his isolation. The dashcam footage of the roadside encounter had gone viral, exposing his behavior to the nation. Vance was no longer just an officer who had misjudged a traffic stop. He was a symbol of small-town corruption, a cautionary tale for law enforcement across the country. The realization was suffocating. Vance could no longer control perception, no longer intimidate, no longer hide behind the pretense of authority. His career, reputation, and future were laid bare before the eyes of peers, the public, and now his fellow inmates. The world he had dominated with fear and prejudice had evaporated, leaving him to confront the full scope of consequences that his actions had precipitated. Vance's first night in the federal facility was a lesson in humility and fear. The darkness of the cell, the unfamiliar sounds of the block, and the palpable threat from other prisoners underscored the gravity of his mistakes. Regret, a bitter companion, settled in. The image of the Range Rover, Kendrick, and Nia haunted his thoughts, each recollection a reminder of the irreversible chain of events he had set into motion. By morning, Vance had begun to understand the permanence of his fall. The cafeteria, the prison hierarchy, the cold, unforgiving routines all reinforced his new reality. The officers he had once commanded were now entirely irrelevant, the federal system now in motion, and his personal dominance obliterated. For the first time, Vance Harlan confronted the true cost of unchecked power, prejudice, and hubris in the unyielding landscape of American law. Weeks passed, and Vance Harlan settled into the grim rhythm of federal incarceration. The facility was designed to strip individuality and enforce compliance, a stark contrast to the small-town freedom he had once enjoyed. Every sound echoed with authority, metal doors clanging, inmates shouting, guards moving with precise timing. Vance's mind was restless, replaying the roadside confrontation endlessly, analyzing each misjudgment, every biased assumption, and the irreversible cascade that had followed. The national spotlight continued to bear down on him. News clips looped across televisions in common areas, showing Vance's aggressive behavior during the traffic stop. Millions had witnessed the exact moment he realized Kendrick and Nia were federal agents. He had been the aggressor, the instigator, and now the story cemented his notoriety. Inmates whispered about him as they passed, eyes alight with curiosity and derision. His identity as a former officer now marked him as vulnerable and infamous. Vance's routine was unrelenting. Meals were bland, the work assignments tedious, and the interactions with other prisoners tense. He quickly realized the hierarchy of prison was dictated by fear, respect, and past crimes, not by former authority or pride. His cellmate, heavily tattooed and imposing, made it clear that Vance's prior power held no currency here. The man's knowledge of prison dynamics was absolute, and Vance felt the sting of impotence with every glance. Yet the most significant threat came not from other inmates, but from his conscience. The full weight of accountability settled on him. Decades of misuse of authority, racial bias, and corrupt practices were now tangible, inescapable realities. Vance's ego, once reinforced by fear and respect, was now a source of intense cognitive dissonance. He saw clearly the consequences of allowing prejudice and unchecked power to dictate action. Visits were rare, but one morning the warden informed Vance he had a visitor. Expecting a lawyer or perhaps an appeal, Vance was stunned when Kendrick Whittaker walked into the room, calm and purposeful. The encounter was surreal. Kendrick, the man whose authority had shattered Vance's world, now standing inches away, observing, measuring. Kendrick presented Vance with a choice: cooperate and reduce his sentence, or refuse and face the full extent of his time behind bars. The plea agreement was clear, the stakes absolute. Vance stared at the paper, the pen heavy in his hand, a tangible symbol of the moral and legal crossroads at which he now stood. Every instinct screamed caution, yet the potential for mitigation was undeniable. Alone with the decision, Vance reflected on loyalty, betrayal, and the illusions of power he had clung to in Pine Creek. The stark contrast between the impunity of his past and the rigid structure of the federal system was overwhelming. Here actions had consequences, and justice operated independently of personal bias or local influence. Vance's pride and ego wrestled with survival instincts as he prepared to make a choice that would determine the remainder of his life. The days blended together in the federal facility, each one a study in monotony and reflection for Vance Harlan. Stripped of his badge, his car, and the small-town respect he had cultivated for decades, he wandered the cell block under the watchful eyes of guards and fellow inmates alike. The enormity of his past misdeeds weighed heavily, echoing in the quiet moments when the cacophony of the prison subsided. Every time the television flickered on in the common room, Vance saw his mistakes replayed. The traffic stop, the aggression, the shouting. The moment the badges revealed the truth. Public scrutiny had cemented his infamy, and the whispers of inmates ensured he could not forget. For a man used to instilling fear, this new environment offered only vulnerability and constant self-reflection. The warden informed Vance of the visitation protocol. One morning, he was led to a small, stark room, expecting a lawyer, but found Kendrick Whittaker waiting. The agent's presence was calm yet authoritative, a living reminder of Vance's failures. Kendrick did not scold or threaten. Instead, he presented Vance with a critical choice: cooperate with federal authorities to expose the corruption network in Pine Creek, or serve the full sentence with no mitigation. The paper in front of Vance was heavy with consequence. Signing meant survival, safety, and a chance at a reduced sentence. But it also branded him a snitch in the prison's unforgiving hierarchy. Refusing meant potential danger and 25 years behind bars, stripped of any hope or influence. Vance's mind raced through the consequences, recalling every bribe, every abuse, every falsified report he had orchestrated. The moral weight pressed on him as heavily as the metal handcuffs around his wrists. Kendrick's demeanor offered no judgment, only clarity. He explained the scope of the operation beyond Pine Creek: corrupt officials, colluding judges, and complicit city leaders. The path of cooperation could dismantle the entire network and save countless innocents from exploitation and bias. Vance stared at the pen, feeling its weight as both a tool of salvation and a symbol of surrender. Alone, Vance wrestled with his choices. Loyalty to the old system, his pride, and the fear of retribution battled against the instinct to preserve life and mitigate consequences. The sterile room amplified his thoughts, forcing him to confront the stark reality that his past actions had created a landscape where survival required moral compromise. Finally, Vance lifted the pen. Each second stretched into an eternity as he made the decision. The signature sealed his cooperation, the start of a journey that would forever alter the balance of power in Pine Creek. The act was both surrender and strategy, a recognition that the world operated by rules he had ignored, and that survival demanded acknowledgement of truth and responsibility. Kendrick acknowledged the decision with a nod, collecting the signed document. The choice marked the beginning of Vance's slow navigation through the consequences of his past, a journey toward accountability and the federal dismantling of a system he had once controlled with impunity. The days ahead would be fraught with risk, reflection, and the possibility of redemption, but Vance's fate had irrevocably shifted. In the following weeks, Pine Creek became a focal point for federal investigations. Kendrick and Nia coordinated meticulously, targeting the corrupt elements of the town's government and law enforcement network. Each action was precise, documented, and strategic, dismantling the system of kickbacks, favoritism, and intimidation that had persisted for years. Vance Harlan's cooperation provided the missing pieces, exposing not just local malfeasance, but the deep-rooted complicity of individuals who had long assumed immunity. Vance, confined in the federal facility, began the grueling process of providing detailed accounts of his actions, the bribes he had accepted, and the cover-ups he had orchestrated. Each disclosure chipped away at his pride, but was instrumental in ensuring that justice extended beyond mere punishment to systemic reform. The weight of truth was heavy, but the alternative, endless incarceration without mitigation, was unbearable. Meanwhile, Kendrick and Nia oversaw the execution of federal warrants. The courthouse and city hall were primary targets. Judge Roy Abernathy, who had signed blank warrants for years, was apprehended in his home office, documents in disarray, a symbol of entrenched corruption exposed. Mayor Philip Granger, caught mid-press conference, was taken into custody with evidence of kickbacks, further unraveling the network of deceit that had permeated Pine Creek. The media captured each arrest, broadcasting images of accountability across the nation. Federal agents moved swiftly, arresting colluding officials and enforcing the law with precision. Vance, observing remotely, understood the full scope of the operation. The same authority he had once wielded with impunity was now delivering justice, methodically and without bias. Within the prison, Vance adjusted to a life stripped of pretense. He interacted cautiously, understanding the perils of reputation and the need to navigate social hierarchies carefully. The knowledge that his cooperation could mitigate risk and reduce his sentence provided a fragile but necessary motivation. He swept floors, performed tasks under supervision, and waited for updates from Kendrick and Nia's operations, the real architects of justice at work. Kendrick and Nia's efforts were far from symbolic. They represented a systemic recalibration, reinforcing the principle that no individual, regardless of position or local influence, could evade accountability. Their diligence in documenting every step, from roadside confrontation to courthouse arrests, ensured that Pine Creek's era of corruption would not easily return. As operations concluded, the town's power structures were thoroughly disrupted. The domino effect of arrests and indictments left Pine Creek's institutions temporarily destabilized, but fundamentally cleansed. Vance Harlan's role, once central, had shifted to that of an informer and witness, a man whose past misdeeds catalyzed a transformative federal intervention. For Vance, each day brought the weight of introspection. The personal cost of decades of prejudice, abuse, and corruption was now inescapable. He faced the reality that his career, reputation, and personal freedom were permanently altered. Yet within the structured rigor of federal justice, there was clarity and purpose. Accountability executed without favoritism, a system beyond the reach of small-town hubris and unchecked authority. Months later, Vance Harlan adjusted to life in federal custody, the monotony and rigidity of prison routines becoming the backdrop to his ongoing reckoning. His daily existence involved menial tasks, the distant echoes of the block, and a constant awareness of the power dynamics around him. Vance, who had once dictated behavior with a badge, now observed others navigating authority and survival with careful calculation. In contrast, Kendrick and Nia operated at the pinnacle of federal enforcement. Their work in dismantling the Pine Creek corruption network had set a precedent, reinforcing accountability and systemic reform. Each arrest, each indictment, and each federal operation was carefully documented, highlighting the failures of local oversight and the necessity of unyielding legal scrutiny. Vance reflected on the cascading consequences of his past actions. The dashcam footage, once a tool for self-preservation, had become evidence of misconduct, a record of prejudice, and an instrument of justice. Each playback was a lesson in accountability, a reminder that authority must be exercised with responsibility, restraint, and awareness of the broader societal impact. Through prison walls, Vance considered the systemic failures he had contributed to, recognizing that the mechanisms of small-town power allowed abuse to flourish. The arrests of Judge Abernathy, Mayor Granger, and other complicit officials demonstrated that corruption was not just individual, but structural, embedded within institutions that required rigorous oversight and intervention. Kendrick and Nia's diligence extended beyond the arrests. They ensured proper documentation, transparency, and adherence to procedural justice. The media coverage, coupled with federal reporting, solidified the narrative of accountability, demonstrating that even entrenched authority figures could be held to rigorous standards of law and ethics. Vance's introspection deepened with each day. The personal consequences, loss of freedom, public humiliation, and the threat of prison violence were immediate and tangible. Yet he began to understand that the broader societal impact of his actions was the true measure of harm. The intimidation, fear, and prejudice he had imposed on innocent citizens, now rectified through federal enforcement. As the Pine Creek operations concluded, the structural reform achieved by Kendrick and Nia became a model for addressing systemic corruption. Vance, meanwhile, continued his slow adjustment to incarceration, a stark contrast to the professional efficacy and recognition enjoyed by the federal agents. The balance of justice, once distorted by local authority, was now restored, and Vance was left to reckon with the permanence of his choices and the enduring power of law applied without bias. The federal courthouse in Birmingham stood as a stark contrast to Pine Creek's humid streets, a fortress of glass and marble, air-conditioned to an exacting coolness. Vance Harlan appeared in court for the first time since his arrest, shackled and seated at the defendant's table. His orange jumpsuit was 2 sizes too tight, a visual emblem of the life that had unraveled due to his misjudgments and abuses of authority. The courtroom was packed. Kendrick and Nia Whittaker sat in the front row, immaculate in tailored suits, not as victims but as architects of accountability. The press filled the back rows, the dashcam footage that Vance had hoped to manipulate, now a cornerstone of the prosecution, showcasing his arrogance, bias, and unlawful behavior. Judge Evelyn Vance presided, her reputation for incisive judgment known to all. The court-appointed defender, Mr. Finch, attempted to argue for suppression of the dashcam footage, claiming manipulation and provocation. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney David Ross with assistance from NIA, presented verified metadata, independent digital forensics, and a surprise witness, Arthur Langston, who corroborated years of illicit activity facilitated by Vance. Langston's testimony was damning. He confirmed the payoffs, the targeting of out-of-town drivers, the racial bias, and Vance's orchestration of harassment and intimidation for personal and financial gain. The courtroom reacted audibly, the weight of systemic corruption laid bare. Vance's prior bravado and self-assuredness dissolved under scrutiny and evidence, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The prosecution played the dashcam footage, focusing on Vance's reaction to the federal badges. The sound of him yelling, the body language of intimidation, and the abrupt realization of his errors were undeniable. The court observed the fear, the panic, and the collapse of his carefully maintained persona. Kendrick and Nia's composure, in stark contrast, highlighted the professionalism and integrity that Vance had so violently misjudged. Judge Vance denied the motion to suppress, affirming the footage as evidence. The courtroom was now a stage where decades of Vance's misdeeds were visible to all. The cumulative impact of his actions, corroborated by multiple witnesses and independent evidence, ensured the inevitability of accountability. Vance Harlan sat in silence, the full scope of his downfall palpable. The authority he once wielded, the fear he once inspired, and the power he assumed inherent to his badge were stripped away. The legal system had corrected itself, demonstrating the enduring principles of justice, oversight, and accountability that small-town arrogance could never circumvent. The sentencing hearing was swift. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, a testament to the overwhelming evidence against Vance Harlan. Guilty on all counts, deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit extortion, filing false police reports, and assault on federal officers. Judge Evelyn Vance delivered her verdict with precision, articulating the gravity of Vance's actions and the systemic corruption he perpetuated. Vance, shackled and seated in the courtroom, listened as the sentence was read. 25 years in a federal correctional institution without the possibility of parole. The enormity of the punishment reflected the totality of his abuses, the racial biases, the intimidation, and the collusion with corrupt local officials. Every misstep, every misuse of power had culminated in this moment of absolute accountability. Outside the courthouse, media coverage chronicled the fall of a small-town lawman, once feared and respected, now exposed as a symbol of corruption and abuse. The images of his arrest, the courtroom proceedings, and the federal intervention were broadcast nationwide, ensuring public awareness of the systemic failings he had exploited. Inside the prison, Vance faced the harsh realities of general population. Stripped of influence, wealth, and protection, he navigated a world where prior authority was meaningless. The environment was violent, unrelenting, and structured entirely by rules beyond his control. Each interaction reminded him that the badge he had relied upon for decades no longer carried power, and that survival required humility and caution. Meanwhile, Kendrick and Nia continued their service in the federal government, recognized for their courage, diligence, and the dismantling of entrenched corruption. Their efforts became a model for civil rights enforcement, a clear demonstration that accountability and justice could prevail even against deeply rooted local authority and prejudice. Vance's reflection in the facility was a study in resignation and awareness. The illusion of small-town power, the belief in invincibility, and the reliance on fear and bias had been shattered. The consequences of unchecked authority, racial prejudice, and corruption were now inescapable, tangible, and permanent. From this point forward, Vance Harlan's identity was irrevocably transformed. Once a figure of local dominance, he was now a cautionary example of the consequences of abusing power. The federal system, guided by law, integrity, and accountability, had corrected the imbalance he had exploited, restoring justice and sending a clear message about the limits of authority in the United States. Months after the Pine Creek operation, Vance Harlan adjusted to the reality of his sentence in the federal facility. Removed from his previous environment, the monotony of prison life forced reflection. Sweeping floors, observing routines, and navigating social hierarchies taught him the limitations of his former power. He understood, more clearly than ever, the consequences of unchecked authority and prejudice. Meanwhile, Kendrick and Nia Whittaker's work continued. Their dedication to dismantling systemic corruption in Pine Creek became a national example of federal oversight and civil rights enforcement. Each arrest, indictment, and prosecution sent a clear message. No individual, regardless of local power or tenure, was above the law. In the prison, Vance contemplated the choices he had made. Every action, biased stops, abuse of authority, false reporting, had contributed to his downfall. The federal system had acted with precision, dismantling the networks he had once navigated effortlessly. The weight of accountability pressed relentlessly, a constant reminder that power comes with responsibility and the misuse of authority carries inevitable consequences. Despite his isolation and vulnerability, Vance's cooperation had spared him some immediate danger. By providing detailed testimony and insight into the corruption network, he had facilitated arrests and prosecutions, ultimately ensuring justice reached beyond the individuals directly involved. Yet the moral and personal costs were profound. He faced loss of reputation, financial security, and the freedom he once took for granted. The broader impact of Kendrick and Nia's work rippled beyond Pine Creek. Their efforts underscored the necessity of oversight, meticulous documentation, and unwavering adherence to legal principles. By holding local officials accountable, they demonstrated the power of integrity and diligence in correcting systemic failures and restoring public trust. Vance's introspection deepened, recognizing the scale of the consequences he had triggered. The town he had dominated, the power he had wielded with impunity, and the fear he instilled were all now exposed and rectified. He came to understand the enduring principles of justice, transparency, accountability, and the rule of law that transcends local influence and personal prejudice. As federal investigations concluded, Vance Harlan's fate remained a sobering example of the personal and societal costs of corruption and abuse of power. He had lost everything, and the systems he had once manipulated had been recalibrated by law and oversight. The transformation of Pine Creek served as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the effectiveness of principled enforcement, with Kendrick and Nia exemplifying the enduring commitment to justice and ethical responsibility. The final chapter of the Pine Creek saga unfolded with a quiet inevitability. Kendrick and Nia Whittaker, having completed the dismantling of systemic corruption, stood outside the Department of Justice building in Atlanta. Medals in velvet boxes had been awarded for their extraordinary courage, yet they did not wear them. Their mission had been one of principle and justice, not recognition. Back in federal custody, Vance Harlan continued to navigate the reality of his actions. He swept floors, performed assigned duties, and reflected daily on the chain of decisions that had led him here. The fame he once craved now manifested as infamy, a reminder of unchecked power and the consequences of bias. The town of Pine Creek, forever altered, had its corrupt officials removed, institutions scrutinized, and practices reformed. The ripple effects of accountability extended beyond local borders, serving as a model for civil rights enforcement and oversight nationwide. Vance, now a cautionary figure, recognized the permanence of the shift. The badge he once wielded had no power without integrity, and the law had prevailed. Kendrick and Nia drove through the bright afternoon sun, a government-issued bulletproof SUV carrying them toward the next operation. Their mission was ongoing, not for sport but for justice. The lessons from Pine Creek, corruption, bias, and the abuse of authority were reminders of why their work mattered. Nia asked if Vance would be watching, and Kendrick paused, acknowledging the reality that Harlan's infamy would follow him. But their work was focused on broader impact, not personal vengeance. The story of Vance Harlan became a study in instant karma and systemic correction. He had believed his badge granted him untouchable authority, that prejudice equaled patriotism, and that small-town power was invincible. Yet in the United States, law and accountability transcend local influence. Vance lost his pension, family, and freedom, while Kendrick and Nia continued to serve at the highest levels, exemplifying justice, diligence, and the effectiveness of principled federal intervention. In reflection, the story of Pine Creek serves as both cautionary tale and testament. Authority carries responsibility, and no one, not even those sworn to enforce the law, is above it. Karma, in this instance, was delivered with precision and justice. For viewers, the moral is clear. Biases must be checked, authority must be accountable, and courage and diligence in the pursuit of justice can dismantle systemic corruption. Kendrick and Nia's efforts underscore that principle. Their calm, calculated approach ensured that integrity triumphed over intimidation, prejudice, and unchecked power. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.